The first sound Harold Mitchell heard that cold March morning in 1979 wasn't his alarm clock. It was the deep rumble of a diesel engine struggling up the gravel road that led to his farm in Butler County, Nebraska. At 5:30 a.m., the sun hadn't yet painted the horizon, but Harold's eyes snapped open with the instinct of a man who'd spent 45 years listening to every sound that didn't belong on his land. He rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor of the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1923. Through the frost-covered window, he could make out the silhouette of a large truck, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like searchlights. But this wasn't just any truck. The distinctive green and yellow colors were unmistakable, even in the dim light. John Deere. Harold's stomach dropped. He hadn't ordered anything from John Deere. In fact, he made it a point never to order anything that required monthly payments. His father had drilled that lesson into him with the persistence of a woodpecker on a dead oak tree. "Son," his father used to say, "the only thing worse than broken equipment is equipment that works perfectly but owns you instead of you owning it." The truck was getting closer now, its engine working harder as it climbed the slight incline toward the Mitchell farmstead. Harold could hear the hydraulic whine of air brakes as the driver downshifted. This wasn't a delivery truck making a wrong turn. This was a truck with a destination, and that destination was his driveway. He grabbed his work pants from the chair beside his bed and pulled them on over his long underwear. His wife, Martha, stirred beside him. "What's all that noise, Harold?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "John Deere truck," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Coming up our road." Martha sat up, instantly alert. She knew what that meant as well as he did. In their 23 years of marriage, they'd never once had a delivery from John Deere. Their equipment came from estate sales, auctions, and the occasional trade with neighbors. Everything they owned was paid for, from the 1947 Farmall M that still pulled their plow every spring to the 1965 Ford pickup that Harold drove to town for supplies. "You don't think Tommy?" Martha started, but Harold was already pulling on his boots. "I'm about to find out," he said, grabbing his heavy coat from the hook by the bedroom door. The truck was in his driveway now, its air brakes hissing as it came to a stop. Harold could see the outline of a large tractor on the flatbed trailer, covered by a green tarp that fluttered in the morning wind. His heart was pounding, but not from the cold air that hit his face as he stepped onto the front porch. The driver's door opened, and a man in a John Deere jacket climbed down from the cab. Harold recognized him immediately. Chuck Morrison, the salesman from the dealership in Columbus. Chuck was in his 30s, always wore a smile that was a little too wide, and had a handshake that lasted a little too long. He was the kind of man who called everyone buddy and acted like every conversation was the most important one he'd had all day. "Morning, Harold." Chuck called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "Beautiful morning for a delivery, isn't it?" Harold didn't move from his porch. "Chuck, I think you've got the wrong address. I didn't order anything from you." Chuck's smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Well, actually, Harold, your boy Tommy came by the dealership last week. Sharp kid, that one. Really knows his farming. He was telling me about how you folks have been thinking about upgrading that old Farmall of yours." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. Tommy. His youngest son, 19 years old and full of ideas about how farming should be done in the modern world. Tommy, who'd been complaining for months about how embarrassed he was to be seen operating equipment that was older than he was. Tommy, who'd been talking about how the Henderson farm down the road had just bought 2 new John Deere tractors and how their corn yields had increased by 15%. "Where's the paperwork, Chuck?" Harold's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. Chuck reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Right here, buddy. Everything's in order. Tommy signed the preliminary agreement, and we just need your signature to finalize everything. This here's a 4440, Harold. 4-wheel drive, 130 horsepower, power shift transmission. This machine will revolutionize how you farm. Harold walked down the porch steps, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. He held out his hand for the folder, and Chuck handed it over with the enthusiasm of a man who thought he was about to close a deal. Harold opened the folder and began reading by the light of the truck's headlights. The numbers jumped off the page like accusations. Purchase price, $28,500. Down payment, $3,000. Monthly payments, $487 for 60 months. But that wasn't all. There was a second page. A disc harrow. A new plow. A cultivator. The total package came to $47,000. $47,000. Harold felt the blood drain from his face. That was almost exactly what he still owed on the farm mortgage. That was 2 years of gross income from his corn and soybean operation. That was more money than his father had made in his entire lifetime of farming. "Chuck," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this says the total package is $47,000. "That's right, Harold. But look at the financing terms. We're offering 8.5% interest, which is below market rate. And Tommy was telling me about your expansion plans. With this equipment, you'll be able to farm twice as many acres in half the time. The machine will pay for itself in 3 years, maybe 4 at the outside." Harold looked up from the paperwork. The sun was starting to rise now, painting the eastern sky a pale orange. In that light, he could see the tractor more clearly. It was beautiful, he had to admit. Bright green paint, yellow accents, not a scratch or dent anywhere. It looked like something that belonged in a magazine advertisement, not in the barnyard of a small Nebraska farm. But Harold wasn't looking at the tractor anymore. He was looking at Chuck Morrison, and he was remembering another morning, 37 years ago, when he was 12 years old. It was 1942, and his father had just gotten word that his own father, Harold's grandfather, had lost the original Mitchell farm to the bank. The old man had bought a new Allis-Chalmers tractor in 1929, just before the stock market crash. When crop prices collapsed and the drought hit, he couldn't make the payments. The bank took everything, the land, the house, the equipment, even the livestock. Harold's father had sworn that day that no Mitchell would ever again lose a farm to debt. He'd worked as a hired hand for 8 years, saving every penny, until he could buy the current farm with cash. He'd taught Harold to fix everything, to make do with what they had, to never confuse want with need. "Chuck," Harold said, closing the folder and handing it back, "I need you to load that tractor back up and take it back to Columbus." Chuck's smile disappeared entirely. "Now, Harold, let's not be hasty here. I know the numbers look big, but think about the opportunity cost. How much money are you losing every year by farming with equipment that's 30 years old? How much time are you wasting on repairs and maintenance? This tractor comes with a full warranty and service package." I said load it up, Chuck. But Tommy signed the agreement. This is a binding contract. Harold felt his temper rising, but he kept his voice level. "Tommy is 19 years old, Chuck. He doesn't own this farm, and he doesn't have the authority to sign contracts on my behalf. You know that, and I know that, and if you try to enforce this contract, my lawyer will know that too." Chuck's face was turning red, whether from the cold or from anger, Harold couldn't tell. "Harold, you're making a mistake here. Farming is changing. You can't compete with 1940s equipment in a 1980s world. Your neighbors are all upgrading. The Henderson farm just increased their operation by 300 acres because they have the equipment to handle it. The Henderson farm also just took on $150,000 in debt," Harold replied. "And if crop prices drop or we have a bad year, they'll be in the same position my grandfather was in 1932. The front door of the farmhouse opened, and Tommy came out onto the porch. He was tall and lean like his father, but where Harold's face was weathered by 45 years of sun and wind, Tommy's was smooth and eager. He was wearing his good jeans and a John Deere cap that Harold had never seen before. "Dad, what's going on?" Tommy called out. Mr. Morrison said he'd be here early to deliver the tractor. Harold turned to look at his son, and for a moment, he saw himself at 19. Full of ambition, full of ideas about how things should be done, impatient with the old ways. But he also saw something else, a young man who'd been seduced by the promise of easy success, who'd confused the tools of farming with farming itself. "Tommy, come down here," Harold said. "We need to have a conversation." Tommy walked down the porch steps, his boots making the same crunching sound on the gravel that Harold's had made. But where Harold's steps had been measured and deliberate, Tommy's were quick and excited. "Isn't she beautiful, Dad?" Tommy said, looking at the tractor on the trailer. "Mr. Morrison says this is the same model they're using on the big farms in Iowa. With this machine, we could plant our corn in half the time it takes with the Farmall." "Tommy," Harold said, "did you sign a contract to buy this tractor?" Tommy's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "Well, I signed a preliminary agreement. Mr. Morrison said it was just to hold the tractor until you could see it. He said you'd definitely want it once you saw what it could do." Harold looked at Chuck Morrison, who was suddenly very interested in examining his clipboard. "Chuck, is that what you told my son? That this was just to hold the tractor?" Chuck cleared his throat. "Well, Harold, the preliminary agreement is binding pending your approval. But I was confident that once you saw the benefits of upgrading your equipment, you'd see the wisdom in the investment." "The wisdom in the investment," Harold repeated. "Chuck, let me tell you about wisdom. My grandfather thought he was making a wise investment when he bought that Alice Chalmers in 1929. The salesman told him the same things you're telling me now. That he needed to modernize to compete. That the tractor would pay for itself. That he was falling behind his neighbors." Harold walked over to the trailer and pulled back a corner of the tarp, revealing the bright green hood of the John Deere 4440. "This is a beautiful machine, Chuck. I'm not going to deny that. But you know what else is beautiful? Sleeping at night without worrying about making a payment. Knowing that if we have a bad year, we won't lose the farm. Being able to look my banker in the eye as an equal instead of as a debtor." Tommy stepped forward. "But Dad, we're not going to have a bad year. Look at corn prices. Look at the export market. This is the best time in history to be a farmer." Harold turned to his son, and his voice was gentle but firm. "Tommy, do you know what farmers were saying in 1929? They were saying the same thing. That it was the best time in history to be a farmer. That land prices would never go down. That crop prices would never fall. And do you know what happened to the farmers who believed that and borrowed money based on those assumptions?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. Harold could see the wheels turning in his head, could see him trying to reconcile his dreams of modern farming with the reality of his family's history. "But Dad," Tommy said finally, "that was 50 years ago. Things are different now. The government has programs to support crop prices. We have crop insurance. The risks aren't the same." Harold nodded. "You're right, son. Some things are different. But human nature isn't different. Greed isn't different. The temptation to live beyond your means isn't different. And the consequences of taking on more debt than you can handle aren't different either." Chuck Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. "Harold, with all due respect, you're living in the past. Modern farming requires modern equipment. You can't plow 400 acres with a 1947 Farmall and expect to be profitable." "Chuck," Harold said, "I've been plowing 400 acres with that 1947 Farmall for the last 15 years, and I've been profitable every single one of those years. Do you know why? Because I don't have equipment payments eating up my profit margin." Harold walked over to his old pickup truck and pulled a small notebook from the glove compartment. He'd been keeping detailed records of his farming operation since he'd taken over from his father, and he knew every number by heart. "Let me tell you about profitability, Chuck," Harold said, opening the notebook. "Last year, I grossed $47,000 from my corn and soybean operation. After expenses for seed, fertilizer, fuel, and maintenance, I netted $23,000. That's a 49% profit margin. Now, if I take on this equipment package you're selling, my annual payments will be $5,844. That drops my net income to $17,156, which is a 36% profit margin. And that's assuming everything goes perfectly. No breakdowns, no bad weather, no drop in crop prices. Chuck was shaking his head. But Harold, you're not accounting for the increased productivity. With this equipment, you could farm 600 acres instead of 400. You could increase your gross income by 50%. And where am I going to get those extra 200 acres, Chuck? Am I going to buy them? That would mean more debt. Am I going to rent them? That would mean higher expenses and less profit per acre. You're asking me to bet my family's future on assumptions and projections. Tommy was looking back and forth between his father and the salesman, and Harold could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him understood what his father was saying, but part of him was still seduced by the promise of the shiny new tractor. "Dad," Tommy said, "what if we just bought the tractor? Not all the implements, just the tractor. We could use our existing equipment with it." Harold closed his notebook and looked at his son. This was the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for since Tommy had started showing interest in farming. This was the moment when he had to choose between his son's dreams and his family's security. "Tommy," Harold said, "let me ask you a question. Why do you want this tractor?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Because it would make our work easier. Because it would make us more efficient. Because..." He paused, and Harold could see him struggling with the real answer. "Because?" Harold prompted. "Because I'm tired of being embarrassed by our equipment," Tommy said finally. "When I go to the co-op or the grain elevator, all the other farmers are talking about their new tractors and their new planters. They look at me like I'm some kind of throwback. Like we're not real farmers because we don't have the latest equipment." Harold nodded. This was the answer he'd expected, and it was the most honest thing Tommy had said all morning. "Son, let me tell you something about being a real farmer. A real farmer feeds his family before he feeds his ego. A real farmer builds wealth instead of debt. A real farmer understands that the land doesn't care what color your tractor is or how new your equipment is. The land only cares whether you take care of it and whether you can afford to keep farming it year after year." Harold walked over to the barn and opened the large sliding door. Inside, parked in the dim light, was the 1947 Farmall M. It wasn't pretty. The red paint was faded and chipped, and there were rust spots on the fenders. But it was clean and well maintained, and Harold knew that it would start on the first try, just like it had every morning for the past 32 years. "Tommy, come here," Harold said. "I want to show you something." Tommy walked into the barn, followed by Chuck Morrison, who was clearly hoping for one last chance to salvage his sale. Harold climbed up onto the tractor and turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and then caught with a steady rumble. He let it warm up for a minute, then shut it off. "This tractor has never missed a day of work," Harold said. "Not one day in 32 years. It's plowed every acre of this farm at least 20 times. It's planted every crop, cultivated every field, harvested every bushel of grain we've ever produced. And you know what it's cost me in payments over those 32 years?" Tommy shook his head. "Nothing," Harold said. "Not one penny. My father bought it used in 1947 for $1,200 cash. In 32 years, I've spent maybe $3,000 on parts and maintenance. That's less than $100 a year to own and operate a tractor. Your new John Deere would cost me $487 a month, or $5,844 a year, just in payments. That doesn't include maintenance, insurance, or depreciation." Chuck Morrison stepped forward. "But Harold, you're not accounting for the opportunity cost of downtime. What happens when that old tractor breaks down during planting season? What happens when you can't get parts for a 30-year-old machine? Harold smiled. Chuck, I can rebuild this engine with parts from the Napa store in town. I can fix anything that breaks on this tractor with basic tools and common sense. Can you say the same about that computerized machine on your trailer? What happens when the electronic control module fails? What happens when the hydraulic system develops a leak? How much will it cost to have a John Deere technician come out here with a laptop computer to diagnose a problem? Chuck was getting frustrated now. Harold could see it in his face, in the way he was shifting his weight from foot to foot. Harold, you're being unrealistic. You can't farm in 1979 with 1947 technology and expect to compete. Compete with who, Chuck? Harold asked. Compete with farmers who are mortgaged to the hilt. Compete with farmers who are one bad year away from bankruptcy. I'm not trying to be the biggest farmer in Butler County, Chuck. I'm trying to be the most sustainable farmer in Butler County. Harold climbed down from the tractor and walked back outside, where the sun was now fully above the horizon. The morning was warming up, and he could hear the sound of other farmers starting their day. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster was crowing, and the smell of bacon was drifting from Martha's kitchen. Tommy, Harold said, I want you to understand something. I'm not against progress. I'm not against new technology. But I am against debt. I've seen too many good farmers lose everything because they confused progress with borrowing money. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the John Deere on the trailer. Finally, he spoke. Dad, what if we saved up and bought a newer tractor with cash? Maybe not brand new, but something from the 1960s or early 1970s. Harold considered this. It was a reasonable compromise, and it showed that Tommy was beginning to understand the difference between wanting something and needing something. That's a possibility, son, Harold said. If we have a good year this year and next year, we might be able to afford a newer tractor without taking on debt. But it would have to be something we could afford to buy outright, and it would have to be something that would genuinely improve our operation, not just our image. Chuck Morrison realized that his sale was slipping away. Harold, I can work with you on the financing. Maybe we could extend the terms to 72 months to bring down the monthly payment. Or maybe we could look at a lease arrangement. Harold shook his head. Chuck, you're not listening. I don't want better financing terms. I don't want a lease arrangement. I don't want to owe money on equipment, period. That's not negotiable. Chuck threw up his hands in frustration. Harold, you're making a mistake. In 5 years, you're going to wish you'd taken this deal. Your neighbors are going to be farming twice as many acres with half the labor, and you're going to be stuck with that old Farmall, falling further and further behind. Harold looked at Chuck for a long moment, then walked over to his pickup truck and pulled out a thermos of coffee that Martha had prepared for him. He poured himself a cup and offered some to Tommy and Chuck. Tommy accepted, Chuck declined. Chuck, Harold said, sipping his coffee, let me tell you a story. In 1973, my neighbor Jim Patterson bought a brand new John Deere 4430. Beautiful machine, just like this one. Jim was convinced that he needed it to stay competitive. He took out a 5-year loan for $22,000. Harold paused to take another sip of coffee. The first year, everything went great. Jim planted 200 more acres than he'd ever planted before. He was the envy of every farmer in the county. But then 1974 hit. You remember 1974, Chuck? Corn prices dropped from $3.50 a bushel to $2.20. Soybean prices fell even harder. Jim's gross income dropped by 40%, but his equipment payments stayed the same. Chuck was listening now, but Harold could see that he didn't like where this story was going. Jim struggled for 2 years, borrowing money to make his equipment payments, hoping prices would recover. But they didn't, not enough anyway. In 1976, Jim lost his farm. The bank took everything, the land, the house, the equipment, including that beautiful John Deere 4430. You know who bought Jim's farm at the auction, Chuck? Chuck shook his head. I did, Harold said. I bought 160 acres of Jim's land for $800 an acre, cash. Jim had paid $1,200 an acre for that same land just 3 years earlier, with borrowed money. I was able to buy it because I didn't have equipment payments eating up my cash flow. I had money in the bank because I wasn't making payments on depreciating assets. Harold finished his coffee and screwed the cap back on the thermos. So you see, Chuck, I'm not falling behind my neighbors. I'm buying their farms when they fall behind on their payments. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the John Deere's diesel engine idling on the trailer. Chuck Morrison looked like a man who just realized he was trying to sell ice to an Eskimo. Tommy was staring at his father with a new expression on his face. It was part admiration, part understanding, and part something else that Harold couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the realization that his father wasn't just a stubborn old man clinging to outdated ways. Maybe it was the understanding that there was wisdom in those outdated ways. Dad, Tommy said finally, I'm sorry. I should have talked to you before I signed anything. I thought you'd be excited about the opportunity to upgrade our equipment. Harold put his hand on his son's shoulder. Tommy, there's nothing to apologize for. You're young, and you're ambitious, and those are good things. But ambition without wisdom can be dangerous. I want you to succeed, son. I want you to take over this farm someday and make it even better than it is now. But I want you to succeed on solid ground, not on borrowed money. Chuck Morrison was loading his paperwork back into his folder. Well, Harold, I guess we don't have a deal today. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. Chuck, Harold said, I appreciate you coming out here, and I appreciate your patience with my son. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about changing my mind. This is about principles that have served my family well for 50 years. I'm not going to abandon those principles for the sake of a shiny new tractor. Chuck nodded, but Harold could see the frustration in his eyes. I understand, Harold. But I still think you're making a mistake. The farming business is changing, and farmers who don't change with it are going to be left behind. Maybe so, Chuck, Harold said. But I'd rather be left behind than left broke. Chuck climbed back into his truck and started the engine. The hydraulic system whined as he prepared to leave. Tommy, he called out through the open window, if you ever want to talk about financing options for when you take over the farm, you give me a call. Harold stepped forward. Chuck, Tommy won't be calling you. When Tommy takes over this farm, it'll be debt-free, just like it was when I took it over from my father. That's the Mitchell way. The truck pulled out of the driveway, its diesel engine working hard as it climbed back up the gravel road. Harold and Tommy stood in the driveway, watching it disappear over the hill. Dad, Tommy said, do you really think I made a mistake? Harold considered the question carefully. Tommy, I think you made a young man's mistake. You saw something you wanted, and you convinced yourself you needed it. That's not unusual. But the important thing is that you learned from it. They walked back toward the house, where Martha was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands. She'd been watching the whole scene from the kitchen window. Everything okay? She asked. Everything's fine, Harold said. Tommy just learned an important lesson about the difference between wanting something and needing something. Martha smiled. Well, come on in and have some breakfast. The bacon's getting cold, and you've got corn to plant. As they walked into the house, Tommy turned to his father. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret not having newer equipment? Do you ever wish we could farm like the big operations? Harold paused at the kitchen door. Tommy, let me tell you what I don't regret. I don't regret being able to sleep at night without worrying about making payments. I don't regret being able to weather a bad year without losing the farm. I don't regret being able to buy Jim Patterson's land when he couldn't make his payments. And I don't regret being able to pass this farm on to you without a mountain of debt. Harold opened the door and stepped into the warm kitchen, where the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. As for farming like the big operations, son, remember this, the goal isn't to be the biggest farmer in the county. The goal is to be the last farmer standing. Over breakfast, Harold explained to Tommy the principles that had guided the Mitchell family for 3 generations. He talked about the importance of living within your means, of building wealth slowly and steadily, of never confusing cash flow with profit. He explained how debt could be a tool, but how it could also be a trap, and how the difference between the two often came down to timing and circumstances beyond a farmer's control. Tommy listened carefully, asking questions and beginning to understand the wisdom behind his father's conservative approach. He began to see that his father's reluctance to take on debt wasn't about being old-fashioned or stubborn. It was about survival. As the years passed, Harold's wisdom would be vindicated in ways that neither he nor Tommy could have imagined that March morning in 1979. The farm crisis of the 1980s would devastate rural America, with thousands of farmers losing their land to foreclosure. Interest rates would soar to over 20%, making it impossible for heavily leveraged farmers to service their debt. Crop prices would collapse, and land values would plummet. But the Mitchell farm would survive, just as it had survived the Great Depression, because Harold had learned the lessons of history and had the courage to apply them, even when it meant disappointing his son and resisting the pressure to modernize. The old Farmall M would continue to plow the fields of the Mitchell farm for another 15 years, until Tommy finally convinced his father to buy a used John Deere 4020 with cash they'd saved from 5 consecutive profitable years. By then, Tommy understood that the tractor wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of the principles that had kept his family on the land for 3 generations. And when Tommy's own son came of age and started talking about the latest GPS-guided, computer-controlled tractors, Tommy would remember the morning when his father stopped the John Deere truck in the driveway and demanded to see the contract. He would remember the lesson about the difference between wanting and needing, between progress and debt, between being the biggest farmer and being the last farmer standing. The principles that Harold Mitchell defended that morning in 1979 weren't just about farming. They were about life, about the importance of living within your means, about the danger of confusing material possessions with success, about the value of patience and discipline in a world that constantly pressures us to have everything now. In a world where instant gratification is the norm and debt is seen as a tool for achieving dreams, Harold's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to say no. Sometimes the most progressive thing you can do is to stick with what works. And sometimes the most successful thing you can do is to define success not by what you own, but by what you owe. The John Deere truck that rolled up Harold Mitchell's driveway that March morning in 1979 was carrying more than just a tractor. It was carrying a choice between 2 different philosophies of life. Harold chose the philosophy that had served his family for 3 generations, and in doing so, he ensured that it would serve them for 3 generations more. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be notified when new videos are published. God bless you.